Hello, adult Sunday schoolers, and welcome to the third installment of our series on Christian ethics. We've already defined the three major approaches that will guide our discussions of ethical issues, so we're ready to start with our very first controversial, intense, and timely ethical question, which is the Christian ethics of war. Today, we're going to survey in this lecturette the various Christian stances on war and start to think about how we, as Christians in the 21st century, should think about this big and important subject. Here's an outline of how the lecturette will proceed. First, we're going to define the topic of the ethics of war by introducing the driving question of this subfield in Christian ethics and Christian moral philosophy. Then we'll consider the question, why should Christians discuss war? Why should civilian Christians in the body of Christ think about this subject? Afterwards, we'll think about pacifism, crusade, and just war, which is basically Roland Bainton, a church historian's distinction of three of the major stances within Christian thinking on the ethics of war. And finally, we'll start to consider the ethics of war within the three major frameworks that we've laid out in the previous lecturette, the universal, subversive, and ecclesial approaches. So let's define the ethics of war first. There are a lot of ways to define this topic, but we'll do it with a question. This is the driving question of the ethics of war. Any argument about the justifiability or the immorality of war answers this question. Is war, which we might define as armed conflict between states, governments, societies, and other social and political units involving hostilities of considerable duration and magnitude, morally justifiable? In short, is war morally justifiable is the question of the ethics of war. Now, why should we as Christians discuss war? Why is it important for us? Many of us at FFA UCC who are not engaged in military combat and who do not have veteran status, why should we think about questions of war? I submit to you two answers. First, I submit to you that war is an inescapable part of our recent history. So the question perhaps is not why should we discuss war? It's how can we not discuss war in our forays in Christian ethics? Just to list a few examples of recent wars, there's the First World War, World War II, the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and of course, most recently, the Russia-Ukraine War. So war is an inescapable part of living in current American society, and it's an inescapable part of recent history, whether we're talking about Western history or world history. Second, I submit to you that war is an inescapable part of the Old and New Testaments. In the Old Testament, the authors claim that God not only commands Israel to fight their enemies, but that God actually fights alongside them. And if you want evidence of that kind of argument, look at Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 to 16, which is about the conflict with the Amalekites, and of course, the conquest of Canaan in Joshua. By contrast, Jesus models suffering love and a call to forgive at radical personal cost. Think about the commands to love your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you, and to turn the other cheek. That stands in stark contrast to the glorious violence well, not glorious, but perhaps glorified violence of the Old Testament. Still, however, it's not completely accurate to say that the New Testament is completely pacifist or nonviolent and critical of military status, because, as we see in Luke 7, Jesus' admiration of the Roman centurion's faith shows that military service is not a bar to inclusion in God's kingdom. And although Jesus tells Simon Peter to sheathe his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, in another gospel, Luke chapter 22, verses 36 to 38, we see that Jesus does not prohibit self-defense and taking up arms as they approach the crucifixion. So now that we've discussed why we should discuss the ethics of war as members of the body of Christ in the 21st century, we'll explore Roland Bainton's threefold typology, or his categories of Christian positions on the ethics of war. And those are pacifism, crusade, and just war. Here's a chart to summarize the three stances, and this would be a good time to pause if you'd like to take some thorough notes. But just to quickly introduce each stance, pacifism is basically synonymous with nonviolence. It's rooted in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and his teachings to love our enemies, pray for our persecutors, and to turn the other cheek. And pacifism refuses to attain nonviolent ends through violent means. Violence is always immoral to the pacifist. Crusade, on the other hand, takes the opposite approach. It draws on the war narratives in the biblical history of Israel, thinking especially about the battles against great odds, which are stories I'm sure that we remember from our childhood in Sunday school. I remember hearing about these battles or learning about them and visualizing them through Veggie Tales and just thinking how grand and impressive these battles were. The crusade approach, and this is the second point, focuses on fighting battles on God's behalf. And so questions of casualties and methods, or how we fight the war, whether we should use biological weapons and nuclear weapons, for example, that's secondary in importance in comparison to the question of whom we are fighting the battles for. This stance is exemplified by the 8 crusades that followed the Turkish seizure of Jerusalem in the year 1072, which lasted until 1270, almost 2 centuries of violent, brutal war. The third approach in Christian ethics focuses on just war, and there are 2 subdivisions in the theory of just war. First, there's the rights and wrongs of going to war. So jus ad bellum is the Latin for this subdivision, which means the right to war, going to war in the first place, declaring war. And the second subdivision in the theory of just war is the morality of doing war. How do we conduct ourselves within war? So questions about minimizing civilian casualties, using nuclear and other destructive weapons would fall under this heading of the theory of just war. The theory of just war also evaluates the morality of wars with some set criteria. So there are factors that theorists of just war weigh to analyze the morality of wars. They think about the legitimacy of the authority to declare war, whether there's a right intention in going to war, such as correcting a violation of a mass violation of basic human rights. Is there an expectation that the good that will be achieved by fighting the war will outweigh the damage to be done? Will the good outweigh the deaths and the other wrongs that will be perpetuated? And of course, the question of proportionality of force, not attacking civilians, not resorting to nuclear warfare or biological warfare. So that's the big picture. These are the 3 major stances in Christian ethics. With that big picture overview, the next question is, what would Christian universalists, subversivists, and ecclesialists argue about the ethics of war? This is a question that I would like to put to the class, and which we will discuss in greater depth in our Sunday school class, actually in less than 2 hours, in about an hour, actually. But just to get us started in discussing that question, using our 3 major headings or branches of Christian ethics to think about arguments for the morality of war, the universalist might say, for example, that war is always wrong because God commands us not to kill one another. Violence is always wrong because it violates our duty to not kill one another, to preserve the dignity and the sacredness of lives of persons made in the image of God. That would be more of a deontological argument. A consequentialist, and again, we're still in the universalist branch of Christian ethics. The consequentialist, thinking about consequences, might actually endorse war, saying that it's important to instill some fear in other nations who threaten the existence of our nation by ensuring them that if they declare war upon us, we will retaliate with equal, if not greater, force. Now, I won't cite any particular political examples of that rhetoric, but that is a consequentialist kind of argument. In order to avoid our destruction and our harm, we need to posture that we are ready to go to war because we want to avoid a very dire consequence. So the consequentialist might argue that to be prepared to go to war and to threaten war is morally justifiable if it will preserve the existence of a nation and deter other nations from attacking that nation. That's just one example of a consequentialist argument. And here I'm just thinking off the top of my head. So these are not developed and polished arguments. Now, the ecclesial view, of course, taking a more Christ-centered focus would probably be more in line with the pacifist by saying that members of the body of Christ who partake in communion and who engage in loving fellowship with one another and who are called to radically forgive cannot endorse war because war, which destroys lives, is antithetical to everything that the church stands for. Again, just one potential ecclesial argument. I'm just modeling how we might think within these major branches on the ethics of war. But what do you think? We'll discuss this question in about an hour, and I look forward to diving deeper into the ethics of war with everyone in our class. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.